She stepped off that wagon weighing 240 pounds, wearing a dress the color of dried mud, and every single person in Pine Ridge Crossing laughed. Not behind her back, not quietly. They laughed openly, the way people do when they've already decided someone doesn't matter. She heard every word. She counted every sneer, and she smiled anyway. Not because it didn't hurt, but because she had learned long ago that the people who laugh at you in the beginning are often the same people who come knocking at your door when winter finally shows them who they really are. This is the story of Maeve Ashcroft, the bride everyone mocked, the woman who saved them all. If this story moves you, hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now stay with me, because what happens next will change the way you think about strength forever. The wagon rolled into Pine Ridge Crossing on a Tuesday afternoon in late October, when the sky was the particular shade of gray that meant serious weather was coming and nobody was in a good mood about it. Maeve Ashcroft sat in the back of that wagon on top of a battered wooden trunk, her hands folded in her lap, watching the town appear through the gaps between the pine trees. She had been riding since before dawn. Her lower back ached. Her feet were numb from the cold despite 2 pairs of wool stockings. The bread she'd packed for the journey had gone stale somewhere around the second creek crossing, and she'd eaten it anyway without complaining because there was nobody to complain to except the wagon driver, a silent man named Hatch, who communicated primarily through grunts. She was 31 years old. She had never been married. She was traveling to marry a man she had exchanged exactly 9 letters with. Letters that were practical and honest and never once romantic, which she had appreciated more than she would ever admit out loud. The trunk beneath her was the most important thing she owned in the world. She had inherited it from her mother, who had inherited it from her grandmother, who had carried it across 2 state lines and 1 river crossing and had never once let it leave her sight. Inside were seeds wrapped in cloth and labeled in her grandmother's careful handwriting, glass jars sealed with wax. 3 journals filled edge to edge with small, neat script, remedies, preservation methods, planting schedules, notes on reading weather by the behavior of animals and the color of morning clouds. Her grandmother had called the trunk the only honest kind of insurance. Her mother had called it everything they didn't teach us but should have. Maeve called it hers. She heard the laughter before the wagon fully stopped. It started with 2 men leaning against the post outside what appeared to be a feed store. One of them said something she couldn't quite catch, and the other one threw his head back and laughed the kind of laugh that carries. Then a woman on the opposite side of the road turned to look, and her expression, that particular combination of pity and barely concealed satisfaction, said everything the laugh hadn't. Hatch pulled the wagon to a stop in front of a building with a hand-painted sign that read, General Store. He climbed down without a word and began unloading a crate from the front without looking at her. Maeve climbed down herself because nobody offered to help, and stood in the road with her trunk beside her and her single traveling bag over her shoulder. "That's her?" somebody said, not quietly at all. "Lord above," somebody else answered. She was a large woman. She had always been a large woman, and she had made her peace with it, which is not the same as saying it didn't sting anymore. She had the kind of broad, solid build that people in her family simply had, the kind that meant she could haul water from a well without difficulty and stand at a cook fire for 3 hours straight without her back giving out. Her face was plain and open, with dark eyes that had a disconcerting habit of looking directly at people, which some people found rude and others found worse than rude. Her hair was brown and simply pinned. Her dress was her second-best traveling dress, and it was, in the flat afternoon light, closer to mud-colored than she had realized when she packed it. She stood in the road and looked at the town. Pine Ridge Crossing was smaller than she'd expected. 1 main road with buildings on either side, most of them practical. A blacksmith, a doctor's office, the general store, a church that needed new paint. Beyond the buildings were ranches spreading out toward tree lines in every direction, and beyond those, mountains that were already wearing their first serious layer of snow. It was not a beautiful town, but it had good soil. She had noticed the soil from the wagon, the rich dark earth in the untended lots between buildings. She had also noticed the way the wind moved through the gaps between the mountains to the north, and the angle of the afternoon sun, and the fact that 2 of the 3 rain barrels she could see were positioned incorrectly to collect maximum runoff. She was still cataloging these things when a man appeared from the direction of the blacksmith shop. He was tall in the way that some men are tall, not graceful about it, just large, with wide shoulders and rough hands, and a face that had been weathered by enough seasons outdoors that it was difficult to guess his exact age. He was perhaps 35, perhaps 40. He walked toward her with the particular gait of a man who was doing something he had committed to doing but wasn't entirely sure about anymore. And he stopped a few feet away from her and looked at her for a long moment without speaking. "Maeve Ashcroft," he said finally. It was not a question. "Silas Boone," she said. He was looking at her the same way everyone else was looking at her, except he was trying harder to hide it. She saw the calculation happening behind his eyes, the comparison between whatever he had imagined and what was standing in front of him. She had written him honest letters. She had told him plainly that she was a large woman and that he should not expect otherwise. And he had written back saying it didn't matter, which was something men said in letters that sometimes meant exactly what it said, and sometimes meant they hadn't really thought it through. Silas Boone, she could see, had not really thought it through. "Long journey," he said. "About what I expected," she said. Another pause. "I've got the wagon around back," he said. "I'll get your things." He reached for the trunk. "I'll carry the trunk myself," she said pleasantly. He blinked. "It's heavy." "I know," she said. "I packed it." He let go of it and stepped back, and she bent her knees the way her mother had taught her, got her arms around the trunk properly, and lifted it. It was heavy. She didn't show that on her face. She carried it around to where his wagon was waiting without assistance, loaded it into the back herself, and climbed up to the seat. Silas stood in the road for a moment watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Then he climbed up beside her, and they drove out of town without much conversation. Behind them, on the main road of Pine Ridge Crossing, the commentary continued freely. "She'll be gone by January," said a man named Tom Garrett, who had the confidence of someone who had never been seriously wrong about anything and therefore assumed the streak would continue. "Silas will send her back east once she realizes she can't handle winter out here." "If she makes it to January," said the man beside him. This was Gideon Holt, the blacksmith, a big man with a booming laugh that he used frequently and without much consideration for who was listening. "Bet she takes one look at the ranch and turns that wagon around before the week's out." The woman who had watched from across the road, a merchant's wife named Clara Finch, shook her head slowly. "Poor man," she said. "He deserves better than what they sent him." Nobody disagreed with her. The Boone Ranch sat about 3 miles outside of town, at the end of a track that had been a road once, and was now mostly in tension. The main house was solid. Silas had built it himself and built it to last. But the yard around it was the yard of a man who had been managing alone for 2 years since his first wife died, and had been focused entirely on keeping the cattle alive and the fences standing, and had let everything else go. The kitchen garden was dead. The storage shed was full of rusted tools and empty crates. The root cellar was half collapsed on one side, with a wooden door that didn't close properly and a smell of rot coming up from inside it. Maeve walked the property for an hour before she said anything. She walked it methodically, covering the kitchen garden and the outbuildings and the field edges and the slope behind the barn where the drainage ran. She took note of the sun angles. She checked the soil in 3 different locations, picking it up and rubbing it between her fingers. She looked at the way the snow had settled on the north-facing slope versus the south-facing one. Silas watched her from the doorway of the barn, arms folded, expression unreadable. When she came back to where he was standing, she said, "The root cellar needs to be expanded, tripled in size, ideally, and rebuilt on that slope there, not where it is now. You're getting moisture from the wrong direction." Silas stared at her. "I'll need lumber," she said, "and I'll need help digging. I can do most of the labor myself, but I'll need at least one other person for the framing." "It's October," Silas said. "Yes," she said, "which is why we need to start tomorrow." He looked at her for a long moment. "Maeve," he said carefully, "the cellar we have is not enough," she said. She said it gently, but without any softness in the actual content of the words. "What you have right now would get 2 people through a mild January. It won't get us through what's coming." "What's coming?" he repeated. "You've got 3 weeks of good working weather left, maybe 4 if we're fortunate. I'd like to use them well." She paused. "I understand this is your ranch and you've been managing it for a long time. I'm not trying to come in and overhaul things for the sake of it, but this is what I know how to do, and I'd like to do it if you'll let me." He was quiet for a moment. A cold wind moved across the yard, picking up dead leaves from the kitchen garden and scattering them against the fence. "The town's already laughing," he said finally, quietly. She met his eyes. "I heard. Building a bigger cellar." He stopped, started again. "People will say things." "People are saying things already," she pointed out. Something shifted in his expression. Not agreement exactly. More like the particular exhaustion of a man who realizes he is out of reasonable objections. "I'll hire the Mercer boy," he said. "Owen, he's 16, needs the work, and he keeps his mouth shut better than most." "That's fine," Maeve said. "Thank you." She went inside to begin assessing the kitchen. They were married the following Saturday in the Pine Ridge Crossing Church, a brief ceremony performed by the pastor with only a handful of witnesses, most of whom appeared to be there more out of curiosity than good wishes. Maeve wore her best dress, which was considerably better than the mud-colored one, and she stood straight and answered clearly when asked to answer and signed her name in the church register in her careful handwriting. Silas stood beside her in a clean shirt and said his words. He was not unkind. He was not cold. He was simply a man who had agreed to something he was no longer completely sure about, and he was doing his best to honor the agreement while his brain quietly cataloged everything that was different from what he had expected. When it was done, they drove back to the ranch. That afternoon, Maeve opened her trunk for the first time since arriving. She unpacked the seeds first, each cloth-wrapped bundle laid out carefully on the kitchen table, sorted by growing season and purpose. Then the journals, 3 of them, their spines worn smooth with handling. Then the herbs, dried and sorted into paper packets. Then 12 jars of preserved food from her own stores, things she had made over the previous summer specifically for the journey and the first weeks in a new place. Apple preserves, pickled vegetables, dried fruit soaked in honey, concentrated broth bases made from bones cooked for 18 hours. She sat at the kitchen table and opened the first journal to a page her mother had marked with a strip of red ribbon. "The winter that tests you is not a punishment," her grandmother had written, in the slightly uneven handwriting of someone who had learned to read and write as an adult and had never quite lost the effortfulness of it. "It is information. It tells you who prepared and who did not. It tells you who shared and who hoarded. It tells you what your neighbors are made of when ease is no longer possible. Pay attention to all of it." Maeve read it twice. Then she closed the journal, put on her coat, and went out to start marking the ground where the new cellar would go. The digging started Monday morning. Owen Mercer showed up at first light, a thin boy with red ears and an expression of determined willingness that Maeve liked immediately. He was not particularly strong yet, still in the phase of growing into his shoulders, but he worked steadily and without complaint, and he had the rare quality of paying attention when something was explained to him, actually absorbing it rather than waiting for the explanation to end so he could get back to doing what he'd planned to do anyway. "What are we building?" he asked, looking at the stakes she'd driven into the ground to mark the perimeter. "A proper root cellar," she said, "big enough to store food for a settlement, not just a family." Owen looked at the stakes. The marked area was considerably larger than the original cellar. "That's real big," he said. "Yes," she said, and handed him a shovel. They dug for 3 days straight, Maeve and Owen and a hired man named Burke, who came out from town for the heavy work. Silas helped in the evenings when he'd finished with the cattle. The ground was not yet frozen solid, but it was getting there, and the work was hard. The earth resisting them, the clay layers coming up in heavy slabs that had to be broken apart and hauled away. Word got around town within 48 hours. Tom Garrett rode by on the second afternoon, slowed his horse to look at what they were doing, and called across the fence, "Silas, what in the name of sense is going on out here?" Silas straightened up from where he'd been working on the timber framing and wiped his hands on his trousers. "Building a cellar," he said. "That's not a cellar," Tom said. "That's a hole the size of a barn." "Bigger cellar," Silas said. Tom looked at Maeve, who was hauling clay in a bucket, and did not look up. "Her idea?" Silas paused for just a fraction too long. "Yes," he said. Tom shook his head slowly, the way people do when they're certain they're watching someone make a mistake, but don't have the standing to intervene. "Waste of time," he said, not quietly. "Waste of lumber. Winter's been mild the last 2 years, Silas. You know that." "Last 2 years," Silas said neutrally. "You married a woman who doesn't know this territory," Tom said, still not particularly quietly. No offense meant, but she doesn't know what winters here are actually like. Maeve set down her bucket and straightened up and looked at Tom Garrett across the fence. She didn't say anything. She just looked at him with those direct dark eyes until he shifted in his saddle. No offense, he said again, less certainly. None taken, she said, and picked up her bucket and kept working. Tom rode on. Owen, who had watched this exchange while pretending to be very focused on his shovel, waited until the sound of hoofbeats had faded before he said quietly, "He does that to a lot of people." "I know the type," Maeve said. "Does it bother you?" She thought about it honestly before answering. "It bothers me the way a sore knee bothers you when you've got work to do," she said. "You notice it. You work around it. You don't stop." Owen nodded slowly. "My ma says people like that are just scared of things they don't understand." "Your ma sounds like a smart woman," Maeve said. "She is," Owen said. "She'd probably like you." Maeve smiled, a real smile, not the performed kind she'd been wearing in town. "I'd like to meet her sometime." The cellar took 2.5 weeks to complete. By the time it was done, it was the largest private food storage structure in the county. A proper underground room with stone walls, ventilation, drainage, and shelving built from timber that Silas had cut himself. The door was double-layered against both cold and moisture. The floor was packed earth over gravel for drainage. There were hooks for hanging smoked meat and dried herbs and rope-strung braids of onion and garlic. Silas stood at the bottom of the stairs the evening they finished and looked at it for a long time without speaking. "It's good," he finally said. "It will be," Maeve said, "once it's full." "Once it's full," he repeated, with the slightly dazed expression of a man calculating how much labor that implied. She had already started on the calculations. She had her grandmother's journals and her own estimates, and she had been studying the sky every morning and watching the animals. The geese had moved south 3 weeks earlier than usual. The squirrels were frantic in the way they only got before a serious winter. The color of the clouds coming off the northern mountains had a particular dense quality that her grandmother had described specifically in the second journal. Not the flat gray of an ordinary cold spell, but something deeper, something with weight in it. She did not say any of this to Silas yet. She didn't want to argue about it. She wanted to show him instead. So she worked. She preserved everything she could get her hands on. The last of the kitchen garden she'd managed to reseed in October. Vegetables she bought from neighboring farms before the market closed. Apples from the half-wild trees at the back of the property that nobody had harvested in years. She made broth bases from every bone she could collect. She dried meat and packed it in salt. She made remedies from her herb stores, elderberry syrups and ginger preparations, and a specific tonic her grandmother had sworn by for fever, made from willow bark and dried chamomile, and 2 other things she kept in unlabeled jars. The town continued to have opinions. Clara Finch stopped her outside the general store one afternoon and said, with an expression of sincere and slightly self-satisfied concern, "You know, dear, you don't have to prove anything to anyone out here. Silas is a good man. He'll take care of you." Maeve looked at her pleasantly. "I know he's a good man," she said. "That's why I'm taking care of him, too." Clara blinked. Gideon Holt, the blacksmith, called over from across the road. "You fill in that cellar you dug, Boone's wife?" "Working on it," Maeve said. "What for?" He wasn't being malicious exactly, just loudly incredulous. "Mild winters last 2 years. Ask anybody." "I have," she said. "It's interesting how often people use last year as evidence for what next year will be." Gideon opened his mouth and then closed it again. She walked into the general store and began her purchases. By the end of October, the cellar held enough food to sustain 2 people through a serious winter with careful rationing. By mid-November, through work that started before sunrise and rarely ended before full dark, she had pushed those stores to something considerably more than 2 people's survival. Silas noticed. He watched her work with an expression that had slowly shifted from doubtful to something more careful and attentive, as though he was revising calculations he'd made earlier and finding the numbers coming out differently than expected. One evening, about 6 weeks after her arrival, he came into the kitchen while she was labeling jars and sat down at the table across from her and said, "I want to apologize." She looked up from her labeling. "When you stepped off that wagon," he said, with the careful deliberateness of a man choosing words with more precision than usual, "I judged you. I stood there, and I thought, He stopped, started again. I'd built a picture in my head, and you didn't match it. And I let myself be bothered by that when I should have been looking at what was actually in front of me. She put down her pen. What is actually in front of you? She asked. He looked around the kitchen, the labeled jars lined up on every available surface, the dried herbs hanging from the ceiling hooks, the open journal on the counter where she kept her notes, the smell of something simmering on the stove that had been simmering since morning. Someone who knows what they're doing, he said. Someone who doesn't need me to believe in them to do it anyway. She was quiet for a moment. I spent my whole life not matching the picture people had in their heads, she said finally. I stopped waiting for people to revise their pictures a long time ago. You either see it eventually or you don't. She picked up her pen again. I'm glad you're the kind who eventually sees it. He nodded slowly. The tonic, he said after a moment. The one you've been making. The one with the willow bark. What about it? My first wife got sick 2 winters ago, he said quietly. Fever. We had the doctor. We had medicine. But she was too weak by the time the fever broke to come back from it. He looked at the jars. I didn't know you could prepare for something like that. I didn't know there was a way to... He stopped again. Maeve didn't say anything. Sometimes there was nothing to say that was better than silence. If winter is bad this year, Silas said finally, I think I'd like to understand what you know. Actually understand it. Not just watch you do it. She looked at him across the kitchen, this complicated, weathered man who was trying, visibly and with effort, to become someone slightly different from who he'd been before she arrived. Get the second journal from the trunk, she said. The one with the green ribbon. We can start tonight. Outside, the wind was picking up from the north. The temperature had been dropping steadily for 3 days. In the morning, she would check the sky again and confirm what she already believed, that what was coming was not a mild winter, not another year to shrug through, not something the town's casual confidence could hold against. But that was tomorrow. Tonight, Silas Boone sat at the kitchen table with his wife's grandmother's journal open in front of him, reading by lamplight, while outside the first serious snow of the season began to fall on Pine Ridge Crossing. The snow that began falling the night Silas sat down with his wife's grandmother's journal did not stop for 11 days. Not 11 days straight. It would ease off in the afternoon sometimes, thin out to something almost manageable, and people would step outside and look at the sky and start to believe the worst was past. Then the temperature would drop another 5 degrees overnight, and the next morning they would wake to another 6 inches on the ground, and that cautious hope would go back inside with them, quieter than before. By the second week of December, the roads between the outlying ranches and town were passable but difficult. By the third week, 2 of the 3 creek crossings had iced over enough that wagons couldn't use them safely. The ranchers who lived past those crossings started showing up at the general store with the tightly controlled expressions of people who were beginning to quietly revise their estimates of how serious this was. Maeve noticed. She noticed everything, which was both a gift and a burden she had learned to carry without complaining about. She noticed that the Garrett family's woodpile, visible from the road when she drove past on supply runs, was shrinking faster than it should for early December. She noticed that the Hendersons, whose ranch backed up against the north tree line, had not been to the general store in 2 weeks, which either meant they were well supplied or the opposite. She noticed that Dr. Elias Vaughn, whose small office sat between the church and the blacksmith shop, had been receiving more visitors than usual, people going in with the hunched, deliberate walk of someone who has been putting off a visit and finally ran out of reasons to wait. She mentioned this last observation to Silas one evening while they were eating. People are getting sick, she said, more than usual for early winter. Silas looked up from his plate. Vaughn's busy? His office light's been on past midnight 3 nights running, she said. I see it when I check the weather before bed. Silas chewed, thinking. Probably just the cold getting to people. Happens every year. Every year there are colds, she agreed. This feels like something moving faster than that. She paused. I've been making extra tonic. The willow bark preparation. He looked at her with the expression he'd been developing over the past weeks. Not the old skeptical look, but something more measured. A man who had learned that her assessments tended to be worth listening to, even when he didn't fully understand them yet. How much extra? As much as I can make with what I have, she said. I want to send some to the Hendersons. And to Owen's family. Owen's family is fine, Silas said. Owen's mother has a cough, Maeve said. He mentioned it 3 days ago and tried to make it sound small. It wasn't small the way he said it. Silas put down his fork. You notice a lot. Someone has to, she said simply, and got up to clear the plates. She sent the tonic the next morning, with Owen as the delivery boy. He arrived at the ranch at his usual time, red-eared and breath-clouding in the cold, and she handed him 2 cloth-wrapped packages and a list of instructions written in her careful handwriting. One is for your mother, she said. 2 spoonfuls morning and evening, not more than that. It's strong, and more doesn't mean faster. Owen took the packages with an expression of carefully maintained composure that she recognized as a teenager's method of handling emotion in public. She's not that bad, he said. I know, Maeve said. That's exactly when this works best, before it gets bad. She handed him the second package. The Hendersons. Go past their gate and leave it on the post. I don't know if they're comfortable with visitors right now. Owen nodded and tucked both packages inside his coat and headed back down the track toward the road. Silas was watching from the barn doorway. When Owen was out of earshot, he said, You're going to run through those stores. Some of them, she said. We might need them ourselves. We might, she agreed. She went back inside without elaborating because she didn't have a tidy argument to offer him. She just knew, the way her grandmother had taught her to know things, by accumulation of observation rather than any single piece of evidence, that what was coming was going to require more than any one family's careful planning. She just didn't know yet how much more. The fever announced itself properly the second week of December, in the way that real illness announces itself in a small settlement, suddenly and everywhere at once, so that it seemed impossible it had been building quietly for weeks, even though of course it had been. Tom Garrett went down first, which struck Maeve as almost poetic, and which she kept entirely to herself. He had been in the general store on a Thursday complaining loudly about the price of lamp oil when he went pale in the middle of a sentence and had to grab the counter to keep his feet. His wife got him home by wagon, and by Friday morning he had a fever of 103 and couldn't get out of bed. Within 4 days, 6 more families were affected. Within a week, it was 14. The illness moved fast and hit hard. A high fever that came on quickly, followed by the kind of exhaustion where people described feeling not merely tired but emptied out, scraped hollow, as though the illness had reached inside them and taken something fundamental. The doctor called it a fever of the lungs, which was honest, if not particularly precise, and he was running between households with a grim efficiency that suggested even he had not anticipated the scale of it. Maeve went to see Dr. Vaughn on a Thursday morning, loading the wagon before dawn so she could be at his office when he arrived. He was a lean man in his early 50s, Dr. Vaughn, with the kind of face that had once been handsome and was now interesting, all sharp angles and deep-set eyes that had looked at too many difficult things to be easily surprised by anything. He had been in Pine Ridge Crossing for 11 years, and he was good at what he did, which was mostly setting bones, treating infections, and managing the kinds of illnesses that frontier life produced in reliable variety. He came around the corner from the direction of the Henderson place and stopped when he saw Maeve's wagon outside his office. Mrs. Boone, he said, not unfriendly, but clearly a man with more places to be than time to get to them. What can I do for you? Other way around, she said. I brought you something. She had loaded the wagon with 6 jars of the concentrated broth base, 4 packages of the willow bark tonic, dried elderberry preparation, and a written sheet explaining what each thing was, what it was for, and how it should be used. She had written the sheet 3 times before she was satisfied with it, making sure the instructions were clear enough that someone exhausted and overwhelmed could follow them without asking questions. Vaughn looked at the items she set on his desk with the expression of a professional confronting something outside his professional framework. He picked up the broth base and examined it. What is this? He said. Concentrated bone broth, she said. Long cooked, 18 hours minimum. Added dried vegetables and herbs during the last 2 hours. You dilute it with hot water before giving it to the patient. 2 parts water to 1 part concentrate. She paused. The people who are sick aren't just fighting fever. They're too weak to eat, so they're losing ground faster than the illness alone would account for. If you can get nourishment into them in a form their bodies can actually use, they have more to fight with. Vaughn looked at her. This is soup, he said. Yes, she said, but made with specific intention. Mrs. Boone, he said, and his tone was careful in the way that professionals are careful when they're dealing with well-meaning amateurs. I appreciate the thought. But what these patients need is medical treatment, not... I know what they need, she said without heat. I'm not suggesting this replaces anything you're doing. I'm suggesting it works alongside it. She met his eyes directly. The Mercer boy's mother. Has she improved? A pause. She has, he said, slightly reluctantly. I sent her the willow bark tonic 6 days ago, Maeve said, and the broth base 4 days ago, when Owen told me she'd stopped eating. She gave him a moment with that. I'm not asking you to trust me on principle. I'm asking you to watch what happens when you use these alongside your treatment and form your own conclusion. Vaughn looked at the items on his desk for a long moment. The deep-set eyes were doing their calculation, and she could see it. The weighing of professional skepticism against the evidence of the Mercer woman's improvement and his own exhausted practicality, because he was one man dealing with an outbreak that was spreading faster than he could track it. Dosages, he said finally. She handed him the written sheet. He read it without speaking. His expression shifted twice, once at something that surprised him, and once at something that didn't. When he finished, he folded it and put it in his coat pocket. I'll watch what happens, he said. I'm not making any promises about what I conclude. That's all I'm asking, she said. She drove back to the ranch and started making more. The next 10 days were the hardest kind of hard. Not dramatic, not the sharp crisis that arrives and forces a decision, but the grinding accumulation of need that just keeps coming, requiring response after response, until the person responding starts to wonder how much of themselves is left. Maeve cooked. That was the simple version of it. The more accurate version was that she worked from before dawn until well past dark every day, managing a kitchen operation that grew steadily beyond what any single person should reasonably have been managing alone. She started with the broths, the most critical thing, the long-cooked bases that required constant monitoring to reduce correctly, the careful seasoning that made them something a sick person's body could absorb rather than reject. She made them in the largest pot she had, then the second largest, alternating so that something was always finishing while something else was starting. The smell of it filled the house and the yard and drifted on the cold air toward the road, and more than once she looked up from the stove to find Owen standing in the doorway, having arrived to collect the day's delivery and gotten momentarily stopped by the smell. Eat something before you take that out in the cold, she told him more than once. I ate at home, he said, more than once. Eat something anyway, she said. He always did. Silas hauled. He had reorganized his days around the delivery route, loading the wagon each morning with whatever Maeve had prepared the day before, wrapped in cloth and packed in hay for insulation, and driving the circuit of sick households in a systematic order that she had mapped out for him based on who was most critical. He was not a man who enjoyed being organized by someone else, she had come to understand. It was a real adjustment for him, accepting the route she'd planned rather than deciding it himself each morning. But he did it, and he did it without the kind of passive resistance she had seen in men who accepted things they didn't like by doing them badly. He came home most evenings with stories that she could tell were costing him something to tell. The Garrett kids, he said one night, sitting at the kitchen table with his coat still on and his face drawn. Tom's been down 11 days. Eleanor's doing everything herself. The 2 youngest are sick now, too. He stopped. She looked at me like I was the first person she'd seen in a week. Maybe I was. Maeve set a bowl in front of him and sat down across the table. She'd take the broth? She took everything I had and asked if there was more. He rubbed his face. Tom Garrett spent 3 weeks making jokes about your cellar. I remember, she said, and now his wife is... He didn't finish it. That's not a score to settle, Maeve said quietly. That's just a family in trouble. Same as any other family. He looked at her across the table. There was something in his expression that she had been seeing more of lately, a kind of searching quality, as though he was still in the process of understanding who he had married and kept finding the answer more complicated than he expected. You're not angry at any of them, he said. It was half statement, half question. She thought about answering quickly and decided not to. I'm tired, she said. There's a difference. Are you angry? She folded her hands around her coffee cup. Tom Garrett stood in that road and said what he said in front of his wife and his neighbors and half the town. And yes, I felt it. I feel things. She looked at him steadily. But the anger is something I carry around separately. It doesn't change what I do. It just rides along. Silas was quiet for a moment. Most people aren't like that, he said. Most people let the anger drive, she said. I let it sit in the back. It tells me things sometimes, about who I'm dealing with, about what to expect. She picked up her coffee. But I don't let it touch the broth. He almost smiled at that. Not quite, but close. They were, she realized, slowly becoming something. Not what she had imagined in the abstract before she arrived. She had not imagined it in much detail, having learned that imagining things in detail before they happened was mostly a way of setting up disappointments. But something real was forming between them, built not from romance or from the particular chemistry that the books talked about, but from shared work and shared difficulty, and the kind of daily proximity that either breaks people apart or quietly knits them together, and in their case was apparently doing the second thing. It was not perfect. He still sometimes made decisions about the ranch without consulting her, and then mentioned them after the fact in a tone that suggested he had not entirely let go of the idea that these were his decisions to make alone. She sometimes worked herself into a state of exhaustion that left her short-tempered in the evenings in ways she didn't always manage gracefully. They were both learning, but they were learning in the same direction, which was more than she had dared to specifically hope for. The second week of the outbreak, Dr. Vaughn appeared at the ranch on a Tuesday afternoon without sending word ahead. Maeve heard the horse and came out of the kitchen to find him tying up at the fence post, his bag over his shoulder and his coat dusted with snow that hadn't been there that morning. "Come in," she said. "There's coffee." He came in and sat at the kitchen table with his coat on and drank the coffee she put in front of him and looked around at the operation she was running with an expression she couldn't entirely read. The kitchen by this point had been transformed. The table was covered with preparations in various stages, jars in process, dried herbs sorted into portions, cloths for wrapping, the written list she kept for tracking what had gone to whom and when. There were pots on the stove and pots waiting to go on the stove. The smell was extraordinary, layered and rich, the smell of food being made with serious purpose. "You're supplying 12 households," he said. 14 as of this morning, she said. "The Kowalski place sent their oldest boy around before dawn." He nodded slowly. "I've been tracking recoveries," he said. "The households receiving your preparations are recovering faster than those that aren't. Meaningfully faster, Sa. Not by a day or two. By nearly a week in some cases." He put down his coffee cup. "I don't like admitting that, because I've been practicing medicine for 23 years, and I came out here with a full education and a medicine bag, and you came out here with a wooden trunk and a set of old journals." "My grandmother was not a formally educated woman," Maeve said, "but she was a very observant one." "What's in the broth?" he said. Not quite a question. She sat down across from him and explained it. All of it. The long cooking time and why it mattered, the specific bones she used and the ratio, the herbs added in the last stage and what each one was intended to do, the logic of giving something easily digestible to a body too weak to process solid food. She talked for nearly 30 minutes and he listened without interrupting, occasionally pulling out a small notebook and writing something down. When she finished, he sat quietly for a moment. "The willow bark preparation," he said. "For the fever," she said, "not to suppress it entirely. The fever is doing something useful, just to take it down enough that the person can actually sleep. Sleep is when the recovery happens." He wrote something else down. "Where did you learn all of this?" 3 journals, she said, and a mother who refused to let me be helpless." He looked up from his notebook. He had the expression of a man navigating the distance between what he had assumed and what the evidence was showing him, and finding it a longer distance than expected. "I owe you an apology," he said, "for the way I received you when you came to my office." "You were busy," she said. "I was dismissive," he said. "There's a difference." She nodded once, accepting that. "I need more of the broth base," he said. "I have 3 households where the situation is deteriorating, and I think it's partly because they have no one well enough to cook for them. If I could take prepared portions directly." "I'll have them ready by tomorrow morning," she said. He looked at the kitchen again. The organized chaos of it, the scale of what she was producing, and the systematic intelligence behind it. "You're going to run short," he said. "I know," she said. "What happens when you run short?" She looked at him for a moment, and he could see the tiredness in her face. Real tiredness, not the performed kind. And underneath it something that was not quite worry, but was adjacent to it. "I'm working on that," she said. She was. She had been working on it for 3 days, turning the problem over while she cooked, calculating and recalculating. Her stores were larger than anyone else's in the county, but they were not infinite, and she had been giving from them at a rate that even her most careful planning had not fully accounted for, because the outbreak was bigger than she had anticipated, and the need was relentless in the way that genuine crisis is always relentless. She had told Silas 2 nights ago, in the quiet way she had developed for telling him difficult things, "We have about 3 weeks left at current pace." He had not panicked. She had come to appreciate that about him. Whatever his other limitations, Silas Boone did not panic. He said, "What do we do after 3 weeks?" "I don't know yet," she said, "but I'm thinking." She was still thinking the evening Owen arrived with a piece of news that clarified the timeline considerably. He came in stamping snow off his boots, which meant it had been coming down again, and he had the expression of a boy trying to be responsible about something that had frightened him. "Mr. Holt's family," he said, before he'd even taken off his coat. "The blacksmith. His wife and both the children are down as of this morning. He came and found me on the road. Owen stopped, reorganized. He asked if there was any of Mrs. Boone's broth to spare. Maeve went still for a moment. Gideon Holt, the man who had laughed the loudest on the day she arrived, who had called her cellar a waste of lumber, who had been loudest and most consistent in the chorus of people who had decided, before she'd spoken a word, that she was not worth taking seriously. Gideon Holt's children were sick, and he had asked for her help. "How old are the children?" she said. 6 and 9, Owen said. She turned back to the stove without another word and started ladling broth into a carrying container. "You're sending him some," Owen said, with the careful neutrality of a 16-year-old who was very aware of the situation, but smart enough not to editorialize. "Of course I am," Maeve said. "They're children." She wrapped the container and handed it to him with the instruction sheet and watched him go back out into the snow, and then she stood at the kitchen window for a moment looking at the dark beyond the glass. She was not, she discovered, particularly triumphant about it. She had half expected to feel something when the moment came, some quiet satisfaction that the people who had dismissed her were coming around. But what she actually felt was tired and scared, in the specific way that comes from standing at the edge of what you have and being able to see the ground from there. Her cellar would not last. Not at this pace, not with the outbreak still spreading, not with the blizzard that the morning clouds had been promising for 3 days running. She could feel the shape of the coming problem the way her grandmother had taught her to feel weather, not as a fact yet, but as a certainty gathering itself at the edges. She needed a different solution, not a bigger cellar, something different altogether. But that was the kind of problem that needed more than one person's resources to solve. She stood at the window until the cold coming off the glass made her step back, and then she went to find Silas. He was in the barn, checking on the cattle, and he looked up when she came in and read her face in the shorthand they were developing for each other's expressions. "What happened?" he said. "Holt's family," she said. "His wife and children." Silas absorbed that. "He asked?" "Through Owen," she said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "So he finally—" "That's not the point right now," she said. "Silas, my stores." She looked at him directly. "I have 3 weeks if nothing changes. But things are going to change. The weather is going to change." She paused. "I need to think about something bigger than what one family can do." He stood with a hand on the stall post, thinking. In the early weeks of their marriage, he would have pushed back at this stage, offered a smaller solution, resisted the scale of what she was seeing. But something had shifted in Silas Boone over the previous month, ground down and rebuilt by the daily evidence of what happened when you took his wife's assessment seriously. "What are you thinking?" he said. She told him. He was quiet for a long time after. Then he said, "That's going to require convincing people who don't trust each other to start trusting each other in the middle of a crisis." "Yes," she said. "In the middle of a crisis is generally the worst time to try that." "It's also the only time people are scared enough to actually try it," she said. Another long silence. Wind moved through the gaps in the barn siding, carrying cold with it. "I'll go into town tomorrow," he said. "We can talk to Vaughn first. If he's with us, it helps." Maeve nodded. She went back inside and stood at the stove and stirred the pot that was simmering there, the last of the current batch, and watched the steam rise and thought about her grandmother's journal entry, the one with the red ribbon. Not the part about winter being information. The next line, which she had memorized without meaning to. When the information is that people cannot survive alone, the answer has always been the same, and it has never been comfortable, and it has always been necessary. Outside, the snow was picking up. The morning Silas drove into town to find Dr. Vaughn, the sky had that particular look Maeve had been dreading for days. Not the flat gray of ordinary cold, but something dense and purposeful. The clouds stacked in layers that pressed down toward the tree line like a hand pushing on a table. She stood in the yard and watched him go, and then went back inside and started cooking. Because there was nothing else to do, and because the cooking was the one thing she could control when everything else felt like it was tilting. She had been awake since 3 in the morning, which was not unusual anymore. She would wake in the darkness and lie still for a few minutes, doing the calculations she always did. What was left in the cellar? How many households were drawing from it? How many days at current pace before the critical threshold where she could no longer guarantee everyone received enough? The numbers had been getting smaller for a week. That morning they had crossed a line she had been hoping to avoid. Silas came back in the early afternoon with Vaughn in the wagon beside him. The doctor came inside without ceremony and sat at the kitchen table and folded his hands on the surface and said, "Your husband explained your thinking. Tell me the rest." So she did. She laid it out the way she had laid it out to Silas the night before. The stores, the timeline, the rate of depletion, the weather that was coming. She put the numbers on the table plainly because she had found that plain numbers, ugly as they were, worked better with Vaughn than anything that had emotional color on it. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You're telling me that in approximately 10 days, possibly fewer if the weather hits hard before then, you will no longer be able to sustain the households currently dependent on your stores," he said. "Yes," she said, "and your proposal is to ask the broader settlement to contribute to a shared reserve that everyone draws from." "Yes." He looked at his hands. "People are frightened," he said. "Frightened people don't share. They hoard. It's not a character failure. It's an instinct." "I know," she said. "That's why the way it's introduced matters." He looked up. "What do you mean?" She had thought about this part the most. She had turned it over during the 3 in the morning calculations until she found the shape of it. If someone stands up in front of this town and asks them to give from what they have while they're afraid, they'll say no. Fear makes every sacrifice feel like it might be the sacrifice that kills you. She paused. But if someone demonstrates it first, gives everything before asking anything, it changes the question. It's not about virtue anymore. It's about following something someone else started. Vaughn studied her. "You're talking about yourself." "I'm talking about emptying what I have left," she said, "publicly, before I ask anyone else for anything." The silence in the kitchen had weight to it. "That leaves you with nothing," Vaughn said. "That leaves us with nothing," Silas said from where he was standing by the window, and Maeve heard in his voice that this was the part he had been sitting with all morning, the part that had cost him something to accept. "Yes," she said. Vaughn looked between them. "There's no guarantee it works," he said. "You could empty your cellar and stand up in that church, and people could still say no." "I know," Maeve said. "And then you'd have nothing, and they'd still have nothing, and we'd be exactly where we're headed anyway, but faster." "Also yes," she said. Another silence. "What do you need from me?" he said. "Come to the church," she said. "Stand with us. You're the one person in this county that people on both sides of a fence will listen to. I can empty my cellar in front of them, and they'll still wonder if I'm desperate or foolish. But if you stand up and tell them what you've seen in those 14 households, what the difference has been, they'll believe it." Vaughn picked up his coffee cup and found it empty and set it back down. He had the look of a man doing a calculation that had more variables than he liked. "When?" he said. "Sunday," Silas said. 2 days, before the weather hits." Vaughn stood up and buttoned his coat. "I'll be there," he said. "I'm not promising what I'll say, but I'll be there." After he left, the kitchen was quiet except for the sound of the stove. Silas came away from the window and stood at the edge of the table. He looked older than he had when she arrived, she thought. Not in a bad way. In the way that serious things age people honestly, filling in something that had been abstract before with the weight of actual experience. "If it doesn't work," he said, Then we figure out what comes next, she said. Maeve. He said her name the way he had started saying it recently, with a weight that had not been there in the early weeks, like it meant more than it used to. We could keep half. She looked at him. Half of what's left, he said. Keep it back. Give half to the community reserve and keep half for us. It's reasonable. Nobody could say it wasn't reasonable. She understood why he was saying it. She understood it was not selfishness. It was the protective instinct of a man who had lost a wife before and was not willing to lose another one, and that the two of them carrying everything for everyone else while deliberately leaving themselves exposed was the kind of thing that could go very wrong in ways that couldn't be undone. Silas, she said, if I walk into that church with half of what I have and ask them to give everything, they'll see it. People always see that kind of thing. He rubbed the back of his neck. It was the gesture he made when he knew she was right and didn't quite want to finish arriving there. You're not wrong, he said, quietly. I know, she said, equally quiet. I wish I were. He was silent for a moment. Then he nodded once, the specific nod of a man who has made a decision that costs him something real and has decided to stop negotiating with himself about it. All right, he said, all of it. She went to him then, which was not something she did often, not yet. They were still building the vocabulary of how they moved around each other. But she put her hand on his arm and held it there, and he put his hand over hers, and they stood like that in the kitchen for a moment without talking, which was enough. The blizzard arrived Saturday night, ahead of schedule. Maeve heard it before she felt it. The wind changing register from its ordinary winter complaint to something meaner and more purposeful. The sound it made when it found the gaps in the roof framing and pressed through them. She got up and went to the window and could see, by the faint light of the snow itself, that the world had been reduced to about 15 feet in every direction. Beyond that was pure white nothing. By morning, it was worse. The snow was coming sideways and the temperature had dropped enough that it crept under the door despite the rug she'd packed against it. Silas went out to the barn to check the cattle and came back with ice on his beard and the report that the track toward the road had already drifted to waist height in the low spots. Nobody's getting anywhere today, he said. No, she agreed. Church is tomorrow, he said. Not quite a question. If the road's clear enough, she said, we go anyway. The storm blew for 4 days. 4 days in which the world compressed itself into whatever space you were standing in, and the silence outside, because a serious blizzard is paradoxically silent once the wind drops, just this endless consuming white quiet, had a particular quality that got inside people. Maeve had read about it in her grandmother's journals. This thing that happened in isolated places during extended storms. The way the stillness and the cold and the sameness of each day worked on people's minds until fear became enormous and reasonable became smaller and smaller. She kept cooking. She made Silas eat properly and sleep properly. And she read from the journals in the evenings because it gave them something to talk about that wasn't the dwindling stores or the unknown state of 14 households they couldn't reach. Owen had been caught in town when the storm hit and couldn't get back, which she hoped meant he was sheltering somewhere warm and safe, and which she couldn't confirm. On the third day, she went down into the cellar and made herself count what was left. She stood at the bottom of the stairs with a lantern and looked at the shelves she had spent 2.5 weeks building and the following months filling, and she counted everything carefully and wrote it down and stood there for a while with the paper in her hand. It was less than she had hoped. More specifically, it was less than they would need if the second wave of fever came. And she believed the second wave was coming, because the pattern in her grandmother's journals described exactly this: a first surge that seemed to be receding, followed by a harder one that hit people already weakened by the first. The blizzard had trapped people in close quarters with inadequate warmth and food, and each other's germs. And when the roads opened again, the second wave would move through the county like fire through dry grass. She stood in the cold of the cellar for a long time with her lantern and her list. Then she went upstairs and told Silas what she'd found. He sat with it. Sunday is in 2 days, he said, if the road's clear enough. They'll clear enough, she said. People will clear them. They'll need to get out by then, everyone who's been stuck. He nodded slowly. And Vaughn. I'll send word to Vaughn as soon as Owen can get through, she said. The roads cleared on Saturday. Not all at once, but in the way that frontier roads clear after a blizzard. Through sheer human necessity, neighbor helping neighbor dig out because the alternative was worse. By the time Maeve loaded the wagon on Sunday morning in the gray pre-dawn, the main track was passable if difficult, and the road into town had been worked enough that the horses could manage it with care. She had loaded everything from the cellar the night before. Not some of it, all of it. The jars and the packages and the preserved food and the broth concentrates and the remedies and the firewood she had stacked against the side of the house and the sacks of dried goods and the smoked meat and the grain stores and the last of the honey and the dried fruit. All of it. The cellar, when she finished loading, echoed in a way that cellars don't echo when they're full. She stood at the door of it with her lantern and looked at the empty shelves. Silas came up behind her and stood looking too. "That's everything," he said. "Yes," she said. He put his hand briefly on her shoulder, then he went to check the horses. She had one more thing to do before they left. She went into the house and got the second and third journals from the trunk. Not the first one, not her grandmother's original, that one stayed, and brought them out and packed them with the other things on the wagon. She had the preparations written out in her own hand now, copied clean and complete, but she brought the journals too because they were the truest version of the knowledge. And if something happened, if the gamble failed and the worst came, she wanted the knowledge to exist somewhere beyond her own head. The church at Pine Ridge Crossing held maybe 80 people if they stood close. On the Sunday morning after the blizzard, with roads barely passable and families only just emerging from 4 days of isolation, Maeve had not been certain anyone would come. 63 people came. She counted them from the doorway as they filed in, stamping snow from their boots, faces drawn in the particular way of people who had been frightened in private for days and were not quite sure how to wear their fear in public. She saw Tom Garrett, still pale from his illness but upright, leaning on his wife's arm. She saw the Hendersons from the far side of the North Creek crossing. She saw Clara Finch and her husband. She saw 3 families she didn't know by name but recognized from market days. She saw Gideon Holt come through the door last, his children on either side of him, the 6-year-old held in one arm. He was a large man who moved large, filling space with his presence the way some people simply did. He came through the door and stopped when he saw Maeve standing at the side of the room, and they looked at each other across the length of the church. He looked away first. Vaughn was already at the front of the room. He had arrived early, as she'd asked, and he stood beside the pulpit with his coat still on and his bag at his feet, and his face carrying the grave, settled expression of a man who has made a decision and stopped second-guessing it. Silas moved through the room, speaking quietly to people, the particular social work of a man who knew this community and understood which conversations needed to happen before the larger one. She watched him do it and felt something she recognized as gratitude, the specific kind that comes from realizing someone is doing a hard thing for you competently. When the room had settled, not fully, there was too much tension in it for that. The low, persistent murmur of people comparing experiences after days of isolation. Maeve walked to the front. The murmur died. She had thought about what to say. She had written it and rewritten it in her head during the storm, lying awake listening to the wind. She had tried different versions, careful ones, eloquent ones, versions that built logically from premise to conclusion, and she had eventually decided to say none of them. She looked at the room. "Most of you know who I am," she said, "or you know the version of me you decided on when I stepped off the wagon in October." A few people shifted. Nobody said anything. "I'm not here to relitigate that. I'm here because the county is in trouble and I think I know a way through it, and I want to show you something before I ask you for anything." She turned to the door and nodded at Owen, who had been waiting outside. Owen and 2 men he'd recruited came through the door with the first of the supplies from the wagon, carrying them to the front of the church in careful trips. The jars first, lined up on the table that had been set up near the pulpit, then the packages of preserved food, then the sacks of grain, then the firewood stacked against the wall. It took 8 trips and a long and very silent 10 minutes. The 63 people in the church watching the contents of Maeve's cellar accumulate at the front of the room. When the last load was brought in, Owen came and stood to the side and the room was silent. "That is everything we have," Maeve said. "Silas and I spent the last 3 months preparing for this winter, and that is the total of it. There is nothing left at the ranch. I brought it here because I want it to belong to everyone in this room and everyone they go home to, and I want you to know that I gave everything before I asked for anything." She stopped. "Let that sit." "Dr. Vaughn," she said. Vaughn stepped forward and she moved aside. He He spoke for about 10 minutes. He spoke the way doctors speak when they have stopped protecting people from information and have decided to trust them with it instead. Clearly, specifically, without the softening language that usually cushioned difficult things. He described what he had seen in the 14 households receiving Maeve's preparations. He described the recoveries and the rate and the contrast with households that hadn't received them. He described what he expected the second wave of fever to look like, and what he believed would happen in households that went into it without adequate food and without adequate warmth. He did not editorialize. He did not appeal to sentiment. He presented the information and stepped back. Then Maeve stood at the front of the room again. "What I'm asking," she said, "is this. Every household that can contribute something, whatever they genuinely have above their own survival threshold, to a shared reserve. Not everything, not more than you can spare, but whatever you truly can give, you bring here and it becomes everyone's." She looked around the room. "Some of you have more than others. Some of you are already at the edge. I'm not asking the edge to give. I'm asking the ones with more to reach toward the ones with less, because that's the only mathematics that gets everyone through." Silence. It was the kind of silence that had different things inside it in different parts of the room. She could feel it, almost hear it, the particular quality of 63 people sitting with something difficult and deciding what they were made of. It stretched. It stretched long enough that Maeve felt the first cold edge of the possibility that Vaughn had been right, that fear was stronger than anything she had said in front of them, that people locked in their own survival calculations couldn't see past them no matter what was demonstrated. And then Gideon Holt stood up. He was still holding his youngest child against his shoulder. The child was asleep, which seemed almost impossible given the tension in the room, but there it was, a small head on a large shoulder, completely trusting in the way that small children trust the person carrying them. Holt did not look at Maeve when he stood. He looked at the room. "I said things," he said. His voice was its usual volume, which was loud, but it had something different in it now. A roughness that wasn't his normal bluster. "When this woman came to Pine Ridge Crossing, I said things that were unkind and that I said publicly and that I need to answer for publicly." He cleared his throat. "My 2 children are alive and recovering because of what came off that wagon over there. My wife is out of fever because of what that woman made in her kitchen." He finally looked at Maeve, a direct look that cost him something visible. "I had her wrong. I had her completely wrong. And I'm sorry for it." He shifted the child in his arms. "I have half a cellar of stores at my place. I'm bringing half of that here today. My family can manage on what's left." He sat back down. The silence lasted exactly 3 more seconds. Then Eleanor Garrett stood up and said her family had flour and smoked pork, and they would bring both. Then the Henderson fathers stood up from the back and said they had grain and lamp oil. Then Clara Finch's husband said they had preserves and candles and sugar. Then 3 more families. Then 5. Then the words were coming faster than Maeve could track them. People calling out what they had and committing it with the particular relief of people who have been waiting for permission to do the generous thing and have finally been given it. Maeve stood at the front of the church and listened to it and felt something she could not entirely name, not triumph, not vindication, nothing quite that clean. It was something closer to exhaustion lifting, the specific lightning that comes when you have been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and someone finally reaches over and takes part of the weight. She looked at Silas, who was standing against the wall to her left. He was looking at her. His expression was the open, unguarded face of a man who had given up managing what showed and was simply feeling what he felt. He nodded once, slowly, and she understood everything in it. The apology still working its way through him, the admiration he hadn't known how to say out loud, the fact of their partnership that had been constructed from nothing over the previous months, and had turned out, against what he would honestly have predicted, to be real. She nodded back. The room was still talking, still committing, still becoming something different from what it had been when the door opened that morning. Outside, the sky had cleared to a hard, bright blue, the particular blue that comes after a serious storm when the air has been scoured clean. The snow lay deep and still in every direction, and the mountains to the north showed sharp against the sky, and the cold was serious in the way that frontier cold gets in the deep heart of January. It was not over. The second wave was still coming, and the roads were still difficult, and there were households she couldn't account for yet, and the county's problems were not resolved by one morning in a church, not even close. She knew that with the same certainty, she knew weather. But 63 people had walked into that church as 63 separate calculations, each one trying to survive alone, and something had shifted in the room. Whether it held was another question, the one that kept her awake at 3 in the morning even now, even after this. Whether people continued to give when the fear crept back. Whether the promises made in a moment of collective courage survived the daily reality of cold and diminishing stores and the long grinding second half of winter. She didn't know yet. That was the honest answer. She knew only what her grandmother had written at the end of the entry with the red ribbon, the part she had not thought about as much as the earlier lines, but which came to her now, standing at the front of the church with the donated stores accumulating around her. The bravest moment is not the one where you stand up. It is the one after, when the standing is done and the real work has only just begun, and you do it anyway. Maeve looked at the room, the talking, the promises, the people beginning to organize themselves without being told, Vaughn already in a quiet conversation with Tom Garrett about household priorities, Owen pulling out the notebook he'd started keeping for delivery routes. And she thought, the real work. All right then. She rolled up her sleeves and got to it. The promises made in the church held. Not perfectly. Nothing about what followed was perfect. But they held in the way that matters, which is that when the second wave of fever arrived 4 days later, moving through Pine Ridge Crossing with exactly the speed and severity Maeve had predicted, the community storehouse in the church was stocked, and the delivery routes were mapped, and Owen Mercer had a notebook with every household situation written in his careful 16-year-old handwriting, and there was a system in place where before there had been only individual families sealed behind their own doors, hoping the worst would skip them. The second wave was worse than the first. Maeve had known it would be. She had said so to Vaughn and to Silas, and she had been right, which was not a satisfying kind of right, the kind where you wanted to have been wrong. It moved faster because people were already weakened, because the blizzard had compressed households together in ways that spread illness efficiently, because bodies that had fought one fever had less reserve for a second one. Within 5 days of the church meeting, 31 households in the county had at least one person down. Within 8 days, it was 44. The kitchen in the church became the center of everything. This had been Maeve's idea, proposed the same Sunday after the donations started coming in. The church had the largest hearth in the settlement and the most floor space, and it sat at the junction of the 2 main roads, which made it the most logical hub for a distribution operation. Pastor Hale, a quiet man who had watched the morning's events with an expression of someone revising several assumptions simultaneously, agreed without much argument. By Monday morning, there were 4 women working the church kitchen alongside Maeve, none of whom she had asked. They had simply shown up before dawn with their aprons and their knives and their own particular knowledge of how to feed people at scale. One of them was Eleanor Garrett, Tom's wife, who turned out to be a more competent cook than her social manner suggested, and who worked with a focused efficiency that required no instruction. Another was a younger woman named Ruth Kowalski, whose husband was down with fever and who had arrived, Maeve suspected, partly because working was better than sitting in a sick house waiting. They did not always agree with each other. That was the honest version of it. 4 women with different methods and different instincts, and the accumulated stress of weeks of difficult winter, confined to a kitchen together for 12 hours a day, were not going to agree on everything, and did not. There were arguments about broth ratios. There was an extended disagreement between Eleanor and Ruth about the right way to portion the grain stores that got loud enough that Maeve had to step between them on the second day. "We are not doing this," Maeve said flatly, standing between them with a ladle in her hand. "We have 44 sick households and limited stores, and I need both of you to figure out how to work in the same kitchen, because there is no version of this that works if we don't." Eleanor and Ruth looked at each other. "Her ratio wastes broth," Eleanor said. "Proportioning assumes everyone has the same number of sick," Ruth said. "Both of those things can be true, and you can still work in the same kitchen," Maeve said. "We adjust the portioning by household size, and we use my ratio. Settled." She looked at them both. "Agreed?" A pause. "Agreed," Eleanor said, the way someone agrees when they would rather have won, but understand that the argument is over. "Fine," Ruth said. They went back to work. Maeve turned back to her own pot and allowed herself exactly 3 seconds of eyes-closed exhaustion before she picked up her stirring spoon. This was the part nobody had written about in the journals. Not her grandmother, not any of the women who had kept records of hard winters. They wrote about preparation and courage and community and the importance of feeding people well, but they had not written about the sheer grinding human friction of trying to get frightened and tired and grieving people to cooperate with each other when every instinct was telling them to protect their own corner. Her grandmother probably hadn't had to write about it because she had assumed it was understood. It was understood. It was just also harder than the journals made it sound. Silas had taken over the transportation operation with the same focused competence he'd shown with cattle and fencing. Once he committed to something, he was thorough about it, and he had organized the delivery routes with a systematic attention that impressed her. He had recruited 3 other men with wagons, dividing the county into quadrants, and every morning they loaded at the church and drove their routes through snow-packed roads that varied from difficult to genuinely dangerous. He came back some evenings with things that marked themselves on his face in ways he didn't always have words for. One night, about 10 days into the second wave, he came in and sat at the table and didn't speak for long enough that she stopped what she was doing and looked at him. "Henderson's," he said. She waited. "The father's been sick for a week. I knew that, but I didn't know—" He stopped, started again. "The oldest daughter, she's maybe 12. She's been managing the whole place, keeping the fire, keeping the younger ones fed on whatever they had, nursing her father." He looked at his hands. "She looked at me when I got there like I was something she'd stopped believing in, like she'd decided help wasn't coming and had made her peace with it, and here I was anyway." Maeve sat down across from him. "What did you bring them?" "Everything I had left in the wagon," he said. "I shorted the Finch delivery a little. Finch can manage. He's got more than he said he had. I could see it in the side shed." She noted that without comment. The math of who could spare what was a constant recalibration. "The girl," she said. "What's her name?" "Didn't ask," he said quietly. "Should have." "Go back tomorrow," she said. "Ask." He nodded. There was something in his face that she recognized from the early weeks, the specific expression of a man encountering things that were dismantling old assumptions, except the assumptions being dismantled now were different from the ones he'd had about her. These were the assumptions he'd held about the county itself, about the solitude that frontier life built into people, and that he had always taken to be simply the nature of things, rather than a choice that could be made differently. "I told you something once," he said. "When we were building the cellar, I said people would talk." "I remember," she said. "I was more worried about that than I was about whether the cellar made sense," he said. "That embarrasses me now." She considered how to answer that honestly. "You were doing the calculation that made sense where you were standing at the time," she said. "The calculation changed. That's allowed." "Is it that simple?" "No," she said. "But it's also not more complicated than that." He looked at her across the kitchen. This kitchen that still smelled of broth and herbs and the sustained effort of weeks. The kitchen where she had been working since before any of this started, and where she would keep working until it was done. "I don't know how to say what I want to say," he said. "Then don't say it yet," she said. "It'll still be true later." He let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "You're the most practical person I've ever met." "My grandmother called it keeping the main thing," she said. "The main thing right now is the Henderson girl needs more supplies tomorrow, and the Kowalski household needs the fever tonic doubled, and I need to figure out if we have enough dried elderberry to make it through another 2 weeks. "And after that," he said. She met his eyes. "After that," she said, "you can say the thing you want to say." The Henderson girl's name, Silas reported the following evening, was May. She was 11, not 12, and she had been managing the household for 9 days. And when he asked her what she needed most, she had thought about it seriously for a moment and then said, "Someone who knows what they're doing." He had driven back to the church and loaded a second wagon's worth of supplies and brought Owen back with him to help her. And Owen had spent the afternoon showing her the preparation methods that Maeve had taught him. And when Silas left, they were both in the kitchen working side by side with the focused efficiency of people who have found a useful thing to do with their fear. He told Maeve this standing in the church kitchen while she filled his delivery jars for the next morning, and she listened and felt something move in her chest at the image of it. This 11-year-old and this 16-year-old in a cold kitchen in the middle of the worst winter anyone could remember, teaching each other how to keep people alive. Owen's good at explaining things, she said. He learned from someone, Silas said. She handed him the filled jars and didn't say anything, but she was smiling when she turned back to the stove. It was during the third week of the second wave that Dr. Vaughn got sick. Maeve found out from Owen, who arrived at the church kitchen on a Thursday morning, with the news delivered in the careful, controlled tone of a teenager who has learned to deliver difficult information without letting his voice break. Dr. Vaughn didn't open his office this morning. Mrs. Finch went to check and he's got fever. The kitchen went quiet. Eleanor Garrett, who had in the weeks of shared labor evolved from skeptic to something closer to fierce ally, looked at Maeve. "How bad?" she said. "I don't know yet," Maeve said. She was already taking her apron off. "Owen, is he alone?" "Lives alone," Owen said. "Always has." "All right." She was already moving. "Eleanor, you're in charge here while I'm gone. The Kowalski portions are on the left shelf in the order they go out. Ruth knows the route." "I know the route," Ruth said immediately, which was the most cooperation she had volunteered in 3 weeks. Vaughn's office and living quarters were a single connected space, a man who had organized his life around efficiency and proximity to work. Maeve let herself in and found him in the back room in bed, which told her immediately that this was serious, because Vaughn was not the kind of man who voluntarily went to bed. He was 53 years old and had the immune system of someone who had spent decades exposed to everyone else's illness and had developed what appeared to be an armored resistance to ordinary sickness, which made the sight of him horizontal and pale more alarming than it would have been for almost anyone else. His fever was high. She checked it the way her grandmother's journal described must, not with a thermometer, which she didn't have, but by feel and by the specific dryness of the skin and the quality of his breathing, high enough to be serious, not yet high enough to be the worst. "I'm fine," he said when he registered that she was there. "You have a fever," she said. "I'm aware of that," he said. "Stop talking and let me work," she said. He closed his eyes, which was itself a measure of how bad he felt, because Vaughn did not take instruction from people without discussion. She worked for 2 hours. Broth, tonic, compresses to manage the fever without suppressing it entirely. She got him to drink more than he wanted to and less than she would have liked. She checked his breathing and his pulse, and she read the information they gave her with the careful attention her grandmother had described. The body tells you what it needs if you know how to listen to it, and listening is not guessing. It is paying attention without deciding in advance what you expect to hear. What she heard was that he was sick but not yet losing, that the body fighting was doing its job, that what he needed was exactly what she was doing, nourishment and management and time. "You've been running yourself into the ground for 3 weeks, she said, not unkindly, when he surfaced enough to have a conversation. "There were people who needed a doctor," he said. "There still are," she said, "which is why you need to recover." He was quiet for a moment. "What's the county looking like?" "Better than 2 weeks ago," she said honestly. "Not done yet." "How many households still critical?" 11, she said, down from 19 last week. He absorbed this. "The shared system is working." "It's working because people are working it," she said, which is different from it working automatically. He almost smiled at that. "You're going to tell me that the system is only as good as the people running it?" "I'm going to tell you to drink your broth," she said, and handed him the cup. He drank it without further argument, which told her more about his current state than anything else had. She stayed for 4 hours and then went back to the church kitchen, but she sent Owen to check on Vaughn morning and evening, and she came herself each evening when the kitchen work was done, and she watched with the careful attention of someone who understood that a community without its doctor was in a different situation than a community with one, and that keeping Vaughn alive and recovering was not sentiment but logistics. He was on his feet by day 6, still pale and not at full capacity but functioning, and he walked into the church kitchen that morning with his coat on and his bag over his shoulder and found Maeve directing a woman he hadn't seen before in the preparation of elderberry reduction. "You should be at home," she said, without turning around. "I should be working," he said. She turned around and looked at him. He looked like someone who had been seriously ill and had recovered to about 70% and was choosing to deploy the 70% because the alternative was unacceptable. She recognized the particular stubbornness of it because she saw it in the mirror. Half days, she said. For the first 3 days, we coordinate on the critical households and you focus there and let me handle the distribution. He stopped. That's reasonable, he said, in the tone of a man surprised to find the offered compromise acceptable. It's what makes sense, she said. You're managing the whole county, he said quietly, looking around the kitchen. The women working, the organized shelves, the routes posted on the wall in Owen's handwriting. We're managing it, she said. That's the point. Gideon Holt became, in the weeks following the church meeting, one of the most reliable workers in the entire operation. This surprised people who had known him as primarily a loud opinion and a blacksmith, but Maeve had suspected it was possible from the morning he stood up in the church, holding his sleeping child. People who were capable of that kind of public honesty were usually capable of more than their ordinary behavior suggested. He showed up at the church on the Monday following his apology, with his cart loaded with supplies and his 2 children bundled beside him, the 6-year-old still visibly recovering but insisting on coming along. And he had put himself under Silas's direction for the delivery routes without being asked, and had driven the worst road in the county, the one past the North Creek that flooded in hard weather and froze into ridges that could break a wagon axle every single day since. He came to Maeve on a Thursday afternoon, finding her in the relative quiet of the side room where she did her preparation work. He stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands, which was a posture that didn't suit a man of his physical presence, but which he managed with a kind of determined discomfort. I've been trying to figure out how to say this for 2 weeks, he said. She looked up from what she was doing. Then take your time, she said. I was wrong about you, he said. I knew that the day after you arrived, probably, I knew I'd been unkind, and I told myself it was just joking, the way people talk, and I kept telling myself that while I watched you build that cellar and fill it, and... He stopped. My kids, he said. If you hadn't... They're recovering well, she said. Because of you, he said. Because of the preparation, she said, and Vaughn and their own constitution. I'm one part of it. He shook his head slowly. You could have turned us away. When I sent Owen to ask, you could have said no. No, she said. I couldn't have. She said it simply, not as self-congratulation, but as fact. That's not something I'm capable of. He looked at her for a moment. That's what I mean, he said. That's exactly what I mean. And I stood in that road in October and... He stopped again. Gideon, she said, you stood up in the church. You said what you needed to say. I heard it. She met his eyes. We're even. He nodded slowly. He was not entirely satisfied with that. She could see it, the particular restlessness of a person who feels their debt is larger than what's been offered in settlement. But he accepted it with the grace of someone who understood that she wasn't going to give him a harder penance just to make him feel more resolved about it. What do you need? He said. From me, practically. What's most useful? The North Road, she said. Someone needs to maintain it better than it's being maintained. If another storm comes down before we're done with the critical households, it could close for 3 days. I can do that, he said immediately. I've got the tools for it. Good, she said. Talk to Silas about the schedule. He put his hat back on and left, and she listened to his footsteps going back down the hall and allowed herself a moment of something that wasn't quite satisfaction, but was close to it. The particular feeling of watching someone become more than you initially had evidence to believe they could be. The turning point came in the 4th week, not with a single dramatic moment, but with an accumulation of small ones that she only recognized as a turning point afterward. The rate of new fever cases began to slow. Not stop, there were still new cases every few days, but the exponential spread that had characterized the first 2 weeks of the second wave lost its momentum. Households that had been critical stabilized. 2 households that had been receiving daily deliveries moved to every other day. One household, the Mercer family, declared themselves recovered enough to start contributing back to the storehouse and arrived at the church on a Wednesday, with Owen and his mother carrying a basket of preserved food that Mrs. Mercer had been keeping in reserve, and the sight of contribution moving in the other direction for the first time in weeks had an effect on everyone present that was disproportionate to the size of the basket. Ruth Kowalski cried briefly, and then was brisk and unsentimental about the fact that she had cried. Don't say anything, she told Maeve. I wasn't going to, Maeve said. The dynamic in the church kitchen had shifted so gradually that Maeve had almost not noticed it happening. Eleanor Garrett, who had arrived as a pair of competent hands and a muted skepticism, had become something closer to a lieutenant, managing the morning preparations with minimal direction, making decisions about portioning that she communicated to Maeve rather than asking about, recruiting 2 additional women to the kitchen by the 3rd week without consulting anyone and being correct that the additional help was needed. Maeve had not told her to do any of these things. She had simply created the conditions, and Eleanor had grown into them. This was, she realized, what her grandmother had meant in the 3rd journal, the passage she had read and not fully understood until now. The best thing you can build is not a structure, but a practice. Structures fall down. Practices live in people, and people carry them forward. The practice was living in Eleanor Garrett's hands. It was living in Owen Mercer's notebook. It was in the way Silas organized the morning routes with a deliberate communication style that he had not had in October. It was in May Henderson, the 11-year-old who had managed her father's household for 9 days alone and who was now arriving at the church kitchen twice a week to help, serious and capable and paying attention to everything. Silas found Maeve one evening near the end of January, sitting alone in the church after everyone else had gone home. She was at one of the pews, not doing anything in particular, just sitting, which was something she almost never did. He sat down beside her without asking, which was itself evidence of how far they had come. "You were right," he said after a moment. "About which part?" she said. "All of it," he said, "but specifically about the cellar, about the winter, about what would be needed." He paused. "About what people could do if someone showed them." She leaned back against the pew. The church was cold and quiet and smelled of wood smoke from the kitchen hearth. Outside, the January dark was complete. "I almost kept half," she said. "I know," he said. "I was the one suggesting it." "No, I mean before that. Before I even talked to you about it. When I was in the cellar counting what was left." She looked at the dark windows. "I stood there and I thought about it. Just keeping enough back for us. Letting the church meeting be about asking people to give without demonstrating it first." She paused. "I thought about it seriously." "What changed your mind?" "I kept thinking about my grandmother," she said. She wrote in the 1st journal that the moment you start calculating what you're owed before you calculate what you can give, the giving stops working. It becomes a transaction, and transactions don't make communities. They make markets. She was quiet for a moment. "I wanted a community, for us, for whatever life we're going to have here." Silas was quiet. Then he said, "I want to build onto the cellar." She looked at him. "Bigger," he said. "Not for us. Well, for us too. But I mean a permanent thing, a community reserve. We build it on the Boone property, but it belongs to the county. Every family contributes before winter every year. There are rules for who draws from it and under what conditions." He paused. "I've been thinking about the structure of it for the last week." She felt something she had not expected to feel at this particular moment, in this cold, dark church, after weeks of grinding work and inadequate sleep, and the accumulated emotional weight of carrying things that were heavier than she had known how to predict. She felt, very clearly, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Not the way people describe that feeling in the sentimental stories, not mystical, not comfortable, but in the plain, grounded way of standing in a specific place and recognizing it as the right one. "Tell me about the structure," she said. So he did, there in the pew, his breath making small clouds in the cold air, while outside the county settled into the deep quiet of a January night, and inside the church the smell of all those weeks of communal cooking lingered in the wood and the stone like a record of everything that had been done there. They sat and talked for a long time. At some point he put his arm around her shoulders, not carefully or tentatively, but the way you put your arm around someone when you have stopped performing the gesture and are simply doing it. And she leaned into him with the specific ease of a person who has run out of the energy required to hold themselves separate. It was not a perfect moment. Her back ached from weeks of standing at a stove. He had a cut on his hand from a rope that had not healed properly. The church was cold, and the night was long, and somewhere in the county there were still 11 households with sick people in them who would need help tomorrow. But they were there, and they were together, and they were building something that would outlast both of them. That was enough. It's the way that enough, when it's actually enough, is not a small thing at all. February arrived the way the worst of winter always leaves, not with a dramatic exit, but with a slow, grinding, reluctant retreat, as though the cold had not yet decided whether it was done with Pine Ridge Crossing or merely resting. The days grew incrementally longer. The angle of light in the afternoon shifted by degrees so small that you could only measure them by looking at where the shadow of the barn fell today versus where it had fallen a week ago. The temperature was still serious. The roads were still difficult. But something had changed in the quality of the cold. It had lost the particular malevolence of deep January and become merely weather again, which was a different thing entirely. The last critical household came off the daily delivery route on a Thursday morning in the second week of February. It was the Henderson family. The father, finally recovered, walking to his own door to take the delivery himself for the first time since November. He was thinner than he'd been, and he moved with the careful deliberateness of someone still negotiating terms with his own body. But he was upright, and he was present. And when Silas pulled the wagon up to the gate and began unloading, Mr. Henderson came out and said, "I'll take it from here," and then took the supplies from Silas's hands without assistance. Silas came back to the church kitchen that morning and walked in and stood in the doorway and looked at Maeve and said simply, "Henderson." She understood immediately. She set down what she was doing and stood still for a moment, which was the only ceremony the occasion got, and then she nodded and went back to work because the work was not finished, even if that particular chapter of it was. But that evening, when the kitchen was cleaned and the next day's preparations were staged and Eleanor had gone home and Ruth had gone home and Owen had gone home, with his notebook tucked under his arm, Maeve sat down at the church kitchen table in the quiet and let herself feel the weight of what had been carried and set down. Not triumph. Something quieter and more complicated. The particular exhaustion of a long effort reaching its conclusion, mixed with the strange disorientation of realizing that the thing you have been organized around for months is no longer the emergency it was. Silas found her there and sat across from her, and they were both quiet for a while. 11 dead, she said finally. Her voice was level, the way voices get when a person has been maintaining composure around a fact for so long that the composure has become structural. In the county, over the whole winter. "Yes," he said. "I keep going over the numbers," she said, wondering if different decisions at different moments would have changed any of those 11. "Maeve." "I'm not spiraling," she said. "I'm just sitting with it." She looked at the table. "My grandmother wrote about this. The accounting you do after. She called it honest grief. Not wallowing, just allowing yourself to know the full weight of what happened before you move into whatever comes next." Silas was quiet for a moment. "What does honest grief look like?" "Like this," she said, "sitting here, saying 11 out loud." She looked up at him. Not pretending the winter was a victory just because it wasn't a complete disaster. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. "It was more than not a disaster," he said carefully. "You know that." "I know some things were done well," she said. "I also know 11 people are buried who might not be if we had started earlier or been more organized, or if I had thought to—" She stopped herself. "That's the part I have to sit with before I'm allowed to feel good about any of it." He didn't try to argue her out of it. That was one of the things she had come to value most in him. The fact that he had learned, somewhere in the months of building their marriage from nothing, that sitting with someone in a hard feeling was different from fixing the hard feeling, and that sometimes sitting with it was the more important of the two. They stayed at the table in the cold church kitchen for a long time, not talking much, and when they finally drove home, the night was clear for the first time in weeks. The stars sharp and extravagant overhead. The kind of sky that only appears after a long period of clouds has finally cleared and the air has been scoured down to its essentials. "Silas," she said, in the wagon on the way home. "Yeah, tell me about the storehouse," she said. "The permanent one. You had thoughts about the structure of it." He was quiet for a moment, and then he started talking, and she listened, and they drove home under the extravagant winter stars with plans forming between them. The construction started in March, when the ground had thawed enough to work properly. Silas had spent the tail end of February doing what he did with things he was serious about, researching it, thinking through it, drawing it on paper with the focused precision of a man who understood that the difference between a structure that lasted and one that didn't was usually in the decisions made before the first shovel went into the ground. He had consulted with Gideon Holt about the materials, since Holt had opinions about everything structural, and most of his opinions were correct. He had talked to 3 other ranchers about placement and access, and the logistics of contributing and drawing from a shared resource without it becoming a source of resentment. The community storehouse was built on the Boone property, on the slope behind the barn where the drainage ran clean and the soil was stable. It was 3 times the size of the original cellar, which was itself triple the size of the cellar Maeve had found when she arrived, with stone walls and a ventilated roof, and a door wide enough for a wagon to pull alongside and unload directly. The building of it was communal in the way that the crisis response had been communal, but with a different quality to it. Crisis response had been urgent and improvised and fueled by fear finally converted into action. This was deliberate. People showed up on Saturdays with tools and lumber and time, and they worked alongside each other in the early spring cold with the particular ease of people who had already been through something hard together and no longer needed to perform anything for each other's benefit. Tom Garrett worked 3 consecutive Saturdays without being asked twice. He was not a man who had transformed overnight. He still had opinions that he stated more loudly than necessary, and he still had the reflexive confidence of someone who had rarely been seriously wrong about things, and had not quite recalibrated that confidence to account for recent evidence. But he showed up, and he worked, and he talked to people differently than he had before, with a small but perceptible addition of listening between his pronouncements, and Maeve took that for what it was worth. On the 3rd Saturday, he found himself working beside her on the storage shelving, and after about 20 minutes of silence, he said, "I want you to know I heard what Gideon said in the church, and I should have said something like that too." She kept working. "You're here," she said. "That's not the same as saying it," he said. "No," she agreed, "but it also counts." He was quiet for a moment. "You could make it harder for me," he said. "Most people would." "I don't have the energy for that," she said honestly, "and I don't think it would teach you anything you haven't already learned." He hammered a nail in silence for a moment. "Eleanor says you're the most stubborn person she's ever met," he said. "She means it as a compliment." "I know," Maeve said. "Eleanor and I understand each other." He almost smiled, not quite, but close, in the way that Tom Garrett did almost everything, arriving at the edge of a thing without quite crossing it, which was simply the shape of him. Owen Mercer turned 17 in April, on a Thursday, and arrived at the ranch that morning as usual and found Maeve in the kitchen with a cake. Not a fancy one, a practical dense cake made with dried apple and molasses because those were what she had, but a cake nonetheless, sitting in the center of the kitchen table. He stopped in the doorway and looked at it, and then at her. "How did you know?" he said. "You mentioned it 3 weeks ago when we were discussing the February inventory," she said. "You said, 'My birthday's in April,' and I've never once had anyone remember it without being reminded, so I wrote it down." He looked at the cake for a moment with an expression that he was clearly trying to manage and not entirely succeeding at. He was 17 and had spent the last 5 months doing work that people twice his age would have found demanding, and the fact of someone having written down his birthday in a notebook alongside inventory lists and delivery routes was, apparently, more than he'd been prepared for that particular morning. "You didn't have to," he said. "I know," she said. "Sit down and eat cake before you go out in the cold." He sat down and ate 2 slices and told her between bites that his mother had talked about applying the preservation methods to this summer's harvest and wanted to know if Maeve would be willing to teach a group of women the techniques before the growing season started. "She says you changed how she thinks about preparing for winter," he said. "She says it used to feel like just putting food up, but now it feels like," she said, "like building something." Maeve was quiet for a moment. "I'd be glad to," she said. "Tell her to find out who else wants to learn, and we'll set a date." Owen nodded and finished his cake and went to work, and Maeve sat at the table for a moment after he left, alone in the kitchen, and thought about what Mrs. Mercer had said. Like building something. She thought about her grandmother, who had spent her life accumulating knowledge and recording it in 3 journals and teaching it to her daughter, who had taught it to Maeve, who had carried it in a trunk across several hundred miles to a place where nobody had wanted her, and found that the knowledge could root itself in new ground just as the heirloom seeds could, not identically to what they'd been before, but alive and growing and feeding people. She got up and went to check on the seeds she had started in the kitchen window in March. They were, as they always were when she gave them proper attention, doing exactly what seeds do. growing slowly and without drama toward the light. The teaching session started in May and ran through June, held at the Boone Ranch on Wednesday afternoons when the morning farm work was done. Maeve had expected perhaps 6 women. 14 showed up the first Wednesday, and by the third session she had added a morning group for the women who couldn't make the afternoon. And Eleanor Garrett had taken over running the afternoon session independently because Maeve couldn't be in 2 places at once. This was the thing she had not predicted. Not that people would learn, but how fast the knowledge wanted to move once it had permission to. She would explain something once, and she could see it happening in the room, the way understanding transfers between people who are paying genuine attention, and by the end of the session, there would be 3 conversations happening simultaneously about applications and variations and questions she hadn't anticipated. Ruth Kowalski, who had cried over the basket of return supplies in February and been brisk about it, turned out to have a particular gift for the preservation chemistry, the specific understanding of why certain processes worked that went beyond following instructions into actually comprehending the mechanism. She asked questions that made Maeve go back to the journals and look things up, which was the best kind of question. "You should write this down yourself," Maeve told her one afternoon. "Your own version. The questions you're asking. Write them down with the answers you find." Ruth looked at her. I don't write things down formally." "You do now," Maeve said. Ruth did. Summer came with the reliable surprise that summer always brought to people who had spent a hard winter in a cold place. The sheer excess of light and warmth, the green that felt almost aggressive after so many months of white and gray, the kitchen garden coming in with a generosity that made the winter's scarcity feel like a different era even though it had only been months. Maeve worked the garden with the focused pleasure of someone doing the thing they were most suited to, and Silas worked alongside her on the evenings when the ranch allowed it, and they learned each other's company in the quieter register of ordinary life, which is a different kind of learning from the compressed emergency knowledge you acquire about someone during a crisis. He was not easy to know. He had kept himself closed for a long time, since his first wife's death, and he had closed certain things so thoroughly that he had half forgotten where the doors were. They had to find them together, which was slow and sometimes frustrating, and sometimes moved backward when she had expected it to go forward. There were arguments about decisions made without consultation, and arguments about the time he spent in his own head without communicating what was in it, and one argument in late June about something that started as a practical disagreement about the harvest schedule and became, as arguments do when they've been waiting for an occasion, about something much older and harder to resolve. She was not easy either. She knew that. Her habit of carrying things alone until they became undeniable had not dissolved just because her situation had changed. She still sometimes made plans she had fully thought through and presented them to Silas as conversations when they were really conclusions, and he had learned to recognize this and to say, with the particular dry patience he was developing, "Were you looking for input or just agreement?" And she had learned, slowly and with real effort, to tell the difference before she opened her mouth. They built it, the marriage, the way you build anything that's meant to last, imperfectly, with setbacks, with days where you wonder whether the foundation is actually sound, and then days where you see something the other person does and you understand all over again why you chose them and why you would choose them again. Vaughn came to dinner in late July, which had become a monthly event after the winter. Not a formal thing, just the doctor arriving on a Sunday evening with a bottle of something and sitting at the kitchen table and talking for 3 hours about everything except his patients. He had changed since the winter, or perhaps revealed something that had always been there, a dryness that was warmer than his professional manner suggested, an intelligence that was genuinely curious rather than just competent, a willingness to have his assumptions questioned that he had not always demonstrated in his official capacity. He had changed the way he talked about Maeve's methods in his professional context. This she knew from secondhand accounts, and from the way people sometimes arrived at the ranch, asking questions about specific preparations in language that clearly came from Vaughn rather than from their own vocabulary. He had never made a formal announcement about it. He had simply started integrating what he'd observed into how he practiced, and the outcomes had shifted accordingly. "I want to write something," he said that July evening, over the remains of the dinner, "about the winter, about what we did and what worked and why." He turned his glass on the table surface. "I want to submit it to the county medical journal. I don't know if they'll publish it." "What would it say?" Maeve asked. "That nutritional intervention during fever illness is substantially underweighted in standard frontier medical practice," he said. that the knowledge carried in women's preservation traditions has clinical relevance that medicine has failed to take seriously because it didn't come from medical schools. He paused. It would cite your grandmother's methods specifically, and yours. The table was quiet for a moment. I'm not interested in credit, she said. I know, he said. That's actually one of the reasons it should be documented, because the people who aren't interested in credit are the ones whose contributions disappear from the record. He looked at her directly. Will you let me? She thought about her grandmother, who had written 3 journals over a lifetime of observation and whose name would never appear in any official record of anything. She thought about the women in the teaching sessions writing their own notes in margins and on loose paper. She thought about the practice living in people, which her grandmother had said was better than structures, and whether the two things were actually in opposition or whether the written record was just another way of making practice portable. Write it, she said. He did. The County Medical Journal published it in the spring of the following year, which was more than she had honestly expected. The autumn harvest was the largest the Boone Ranch had produced in 6 years. Silas said this with a particular quiet satisfaction, standing at the edge of the kitchen garden in September with the late afternoon light coming sideways across the beds. He had not said it to her as a compliment exactly, more as an observation that contained a compliment without requiring him to ornament it further, which was how he communicated when something mattered to him. The community storehouse received its first contributions in October, families bringing a portion of their harvest before winter, as had been agreed in the spring meeting about the permanent reserve. Not everyone brought as much as they could have. There was one family Maeve knew of that brought considerably less than was proportional to what they'd drawn from the shared supplies the previous winter, and she sat with her own feelings about that for 2 days before deciding that the system had to be able to accommodate imperfect participation and still function, because the alternative was a system that only worked when everyone was perfect, which was the same as a system that never worked. She wrote this down in her own journal, the one she had started the week after arriving in Pine Ridge Crossing, thinner than her grandmother's but growing. The first entry was dated the night she arrived, which she had spent sleepless in the unfamiliar house listening to unfamiliar sounds. She had written, I don't know yet whether this was the right decision. I know the trunk is here, and the seeds are here, and I am here, and those are the things I can control. The October entry, a year later almost exactly, read differently. Not triumphant. She had said what she meant about not letting the winter be called a victory just because it wasn't a disaster. 11 people gone. She had not forgotten them and did not intend to. But the writing in October was different in quality from the writing in that first week. More grounded, less provisional. The writing of a person who understood where she was standing, even when she was uncertain about what came next. She wrote about the teaching sessions, and about Ruth's questions, and about May Henderson, now 12, who had come to the last 3 Wednesday sessions and listened with an intensity that reminded Maeve of herself at that age, when she had sat beside her mother and realized that the knowledge being handed to her was not just practical but precious, was not just skill but inheritance. She wrote about Silas in terms she would have found embarrassing to say out loud, which was one of the functions a journal served. She wrote about the specific unsentimental love that had grown between them, not the love of the novels she had read, which was full of overwhelming feeling and transformative moments, but the love of daily chosen proximity, of 2 people deciding every morning by their actions that this was the life they were building and that the other person was part of the foundation of it. She wrote, He is not what I expected. Neither am I, probably, from his side of it. I think we are both better than we expected, which is rarer than people admit. Owen left for the territory capital in November, which she had known was coming since July, and which she had been quietly preparing herself for since then. He had been accepted to study at the Territorial Agricultural College, which offered a certificate in land management that would give him something formal to attach to everything he had learned in the previous year. He came to say goodbye on a Wednesday morning, his bag packed, looking very slightly taller than he had in October of the previous year, and very slightly less like a boy. He stood in the kitchen and looked around at it, the labeled jars, the hanging herbs, the journals on the counter, the general organized purposefulness of the space. And then he looked at Maeve with an expression that was managing itself imperfectly, the way his expressions did when he was feeling something he considered too large for the occasion. I don't know how to thank you, he said. Then don't try, she said. Come back and show me what you learned. That might not be for a while, he said. I know, she said. I'll be here. He nodded. He was struggling, and they both knew it, and neither of them made it worse by acknowledging it directly. The notebook, he said. I kept it. The delivery routes and the household records. I left a copy with Silas. Good, she said. In case something else happens, he said. So it doesn't have to start from scratch again. She looked at him, the 17-year-old who had walked out to the ranch in October of last year with red ears and determined willingness, who had dug a cellar and hauled broth through blizzard, and learned that practical knowledge was the most serious kind of knowledge there was. And she felt something that was not quite maternal and not quite something else, but was in the neighborhood of both. Owen, she said, you walked into this knowing nothing and you paid attention to everything. That's not common. Don't let anyone tell you it's small. He got in the wagon that was waiting on the road, driven by his father, and he looked back once and then looked forward, the way you have to. She stood at the gate until the wagon was past the tree line, and then she went back inside. Winter came again in December, the way winter always comes in the mountains. Not as a surprise, but as a return. The cold settling in with the familiarity of something that had been here before and would be here again. The storehouse was full. The delivery routes were written in Owen's careful handwriting, and a copy existed in 3 separate places. 14 women had been through the preservation sessions and had their own notes. Ruth Kowalski had filled half of her notebook. May Henderson had started a notebook of her own. Vaughn's article had gone out to a second journal after the first published it, and he had received 2 letters from other frontier doctors asking questions about the nutritional protocols, and he had written back with what he knew and directed them to Maeve for the parts he didn't. And she had written detailed responses that were, she understood, themselves a form of the journals her grandmother had kept, knowledge insisting on traveling further than the person who held it. On a Sunday evening in December, the county held a small gathering at the church to mark the opening of the permanent community storehouse for its first official winter of operation. It was not a formal ceremony. Nobody had suggested a ceremony, which was either because people were practical or because they understood that the thing they were marking was too large and too ongoing to be adequately addressed by a ceremony and better honored by continued action. Maeve stood with Silas in the church and watched the room. She saw Eleanor Garrett explaining something to a younger woman she didn't recognize, a new arrival from the look of her, explaining it with the particular ease of someone who knows a thing well enough to teach it without thinking, which was exactly the ease Maeve had hoped Eleanor would develop and had deliberately tried not to interfere with when she started to. She saw Gideon Holt with his children, the youngest, now healed and fully recovered, running between adult legs with a reckless confidence that this space was safe, which it was, which was not accidental. She saw Tom Garrett talking to a man she didn't know and listening, actually listening, with the body language of attention rather than waiting. And the small shift in him that had started in the church the previous January had apparently settled into something more permanent, which was not a transformation exactly, but was a change. And change was what was available in real life as opposed to the stories where people became different people rather than merely becoming different versions of themselves. She saw Vaughn across the room talking to Ruth Kowalski, and Ruth was showing him something in her notebook, and he was nodding with the focused attention of a man encountering something genuinely interesting, and that was an image she thought she would carry for a long time. Silas stood beside her with his hand at her back, not dramatically, just there. "You're doing the thing," he said quietly. "What thing?" "Cataloging," he said, looking around the room and cataloging everything. "Habit," she said. "I know," he said. "I've watched you do it for 14 months. A pause. "What do you see?" She looked at the room for a moment, at the ordinary, difficult, imperfect human gathering of it, the conversations and the awkwardness and the children underfoot and the people still navigating the complicated history of what they had all been through together and what it had required them to reveal about themselves. "I see people who went through something hard and didn't go back to exactly who they were before it," she said, "which is not guaranteed. Most of the time people go back. But not here. Not entirely," she said. "Not yet." He considered that. "Because of you?" She shook her head. "Because of themselves," she said. "I just provided the occasion." He made a quiet sound that was skeptical without being argumentative, which was its own form of respect. He knew better than to push her on this particular point, and he also knew that she was not being falsely modest but was saying the precise thing she meant, which was that you could not give people courage or community, or the willingness to open their hands when fear told them to close them. You could only demonstrate that it was possible and create conditions where choosing it was easier than not choosing it. The rest was always theirs. She had learned this from her grandmother's journals and from her mother's example, and from 14 months in Pine Ridge Crossing, and from every wrong assumption she had corrected and every recalculation she had made, and every morning she had gotten up before dawn and started cooking because the cooking was what she could do, and so she did it. Not because she had known how it would turn out, but because doing the thing that was in front of you with the most honesty and care you could manage was the only strategy that had ever reliably worked. She had not saved the county. The county had saved itself, once it understood that saving itself was possible. She had showed it that the door was there. That was enough. Not a small thing, not a complete thing, but enough. The real kind of enough. The kind that leaves room for more work tomorrow, which was the only kind of enough worth having. Later that night, driving home under a sky full of stars, she reached into her coat pocket and found what she'd put there that morning without quite planning to. A small cloth package tied with kitchen string. Inside were seeds, heirloom seeds from the trunk, saved from this year's garden to be planted next spring. She had started doing this automatically, saving what would be needed for the next season without being asked, without it being a decision exactly. Just the quiet, ongoing practice of someone who understood that the work was always already beginning again. She held the packet in her hand for a moment in the cold air, feeling the weight of it, which was light. Then she put it back in her pocket and held Silas's arm, and they drove home to Pine Ridge Crossing, which was not a beautiful town but had good soil and was learning, slowly and imperfectly and with considerable human difficulty, what it meant to grow something together.